around the Cape. People know. It's just a matter of figuring out ideas to get them to come.
Well, we'll continue to work on this together.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we have a graduate of Truro Central School who is now our esteemed state senator and also a Truro local. So Senator Julian Cyr is here for a legislative update. Thank you so much for coming to us, and welcome home.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and members of the board and Town Manager Palmer. It's really nice to be able to, I think the commute over here took about 2 minutes, which is not typically the job. There's not typically the commute when you represent 20 towns across most of Cape Cod and several islands. So what we've been doing, I felt really important, took a page out of a number of my colleagues who represent sort of what I fondly called in the legislature sort of the hinterland districts, right, where you have I'm a senator who represents the third most towns, municipalities in the state, is really making sure that I do my due diligence to visit with all the boards of selectmen, members of town boards of all the communities that I represent. And we're saving Truro. You're one of the last. We'll be in Orleans as well, and I think that'll finish it up. But I think it's really important because so much of the work that so many of the bills and legislation that we pass and try to get signed ends up coming down from an implementation perspective is done right here at the local level. And so many of the things that y'all want to do flow through Beacon Hill in some way. And I think it's really, really important. Certainly this is a community and a board where I have relationships with everyone on this board and have my pulse in Truro, but wanted to make sure that, that I came. So I'm glad to give a quick legislative update and then talk about, issues that you'd like me to address, having a conversation. I mean, I don't think it'll be a surprise to you, Mr. Coburn's remarks earlier. I mean, this is sort of what prompted me in part to run for state senate. And I think, frankly, if we don't get our act together on housing affordability and on having a diverse housing stock that has various price points, we're just not going to have a future here. And you look at the generation that's here, look at the faces who are, I'm actually relaxed. There's a little bit of a baby boom going on in my cohort of young folks who grew up in Truro. Our families, mix of sort of Washer folks and also folks who, natives. Those folks we're now in our early 30s, and we're having babies. There's going to be 3 new Truro babies actually coming in March and April, which I'm so tremendously excited about. All 3 of these families are here because our parents have a foothold here. Our families have a foothold here. In most cases, they're living either with their families or sort of in adjacent properties that their families have. I think on the education conversation, the challenges around school enrollment, what Truro is facing is actually, you folks are actually, from my vantage point, actually in a much better perspective than most other communities, even in nearby communities. I think if you look at the Nauset schools, especially in Eastham and Wellfleet and their enrollment, if you look at the downsizing of enrollment in across the school districts, when I was a senior at Nauset, the school classes were about half of the kids were in kindergarten. Nauset's been able to balance that in part through school choice. But I think that there will be I think the conversations that will actually be had here across the region are around, all right, do you merge the middle school and the high school into one facility? Do you actually put the 6th grades back to the elementary schools? So I actually think I'm really proud to see Truro sort of being able to revitalize our 6th grade program. One, because I think actually that's where a lot of towns are going to end up going anyway, just based on the enrollment. And I think based on a willingness, Bob, or a lack of willingness to kind of confront some of the harder conversations that Bob was talking about earlier. So I think that that's a component that we're going to be seeing I think also, too, from a population perspective, Truro's doing a little better than we thought. And I think in part, I think it's just due to this. I think we just have a tight-knit community here where folks are really invested in one another, and people want to come home and want to come back and be here and raise their families. And that's the case in my family, and that's the case in my best friend's family, and in those of the people who are, here in my generation, and it's making a difference. As I sit here watching, looking at a painting of Dutra's, and I think about my best friend who's now a speech and language pathologist in Orleans, and my sister and her wife who've moved back. They now are living in Brewster, but my sister-in-law's sister, so I don't know what that makes me, she's actually pregnant and coming home. So there's a lot, there's some good stories here. From a legislative perspective, often part of what we try to do, and I have a terrific partner in Sarah Peak, who really has honed her skills as someone who can really navigate the legislature, especially in the House, which is a much more raucous, big environment. I'm fortunate to be a member of one of 40. We've had several home rule petitions that have come through. House Bill 2424, which authorized the town of Truro to convey an easement on conservation that was actually signed by the governor on November 21st. The other home rule petition that we have for Truro is a perennial favorite related to expansion of room occupancy. This bill and these local home rules on room occupancy are on hold, which is actually good news, because after much headbanging on this issue, I believe that when Rep. Peak first went to Beacon Hill 11 years ago, she filed this for the first time. We're actually seeing, or we're hearing tangible traction on expansion of short-term rentals to Airbnbs and Airbnbs and short-term rentals. You don't need to hear it from me what a game changer this is going to be for the town from a revenue perspective. So the Senate actually has passed this twice in our budget. We really want to see this happen. The Speaker of the House has made a commitment that they're going to get it done. We were hoping that we could have got it done in 2017. It looks like it's going to be in 2018. My hunch is that it'll probably be done in the budget. And one thing I think that I've raised with colleagues is important is around the implementation of this, right? We wouldn't want to have an expansion of a new tax go into place on sort of July 1st and ask folks to sort of run around and collect that in their season. But I think this is something that we're optimistic in. As a delegation, we've been spending a lot of time thinking about how do we, as representatives working with the state, how do we get the state to really pitch in for the tremendous wastewater challenges that we have across the region? I know that Truro is actually the community that I represent that has the least of these challenges, probably Truro and Aquina. But for almost every other community I represent, across Cape Cod, we have over a $4 billion problem. On the islands, hundreds of millions of dollars. In Martha's Vineyard, on Nantucket as well. As folks I'm sure know, we're under court action to move forward on this, and there's a real need for us to look at how are we going to come up with resources from the state. If the $4 billion amount is going to be done just based on property tax assessments or betterments alone, we are talking about a doubling probably of property taxes. Our property tax rates here are relatively lower, in thanks part because of the seasonal, a lot of folks who are here seasonally. But talk about from an affordability perspective, something that's totally untenable. So under what's called the 208 plan, there is a commitment for the state to chip in about 25% of that $4 billion. So about $1 billion. And the question we've been really chewing over in the delegation is, well, where the heck are we going to get, about $20 to $30 million over like a 30, 40, 50-year period? That is really, really hard to do. It's near impossible to do from an appropriations perspective, especially because, turnover is part of the work that we have. So we've been really looking at where is this going to come from. And the vehicle that's moving where we think we're going to be able to get some state support for this, the state support, the quarter $1 billion component of this, is from expansion of short-term room occupancy. And in the expansion of the room occupancy, is that not an opportunity to look at room occupancy as a whole as a means for the state to pitch in their billion for this program. So there's several proposals going around. One would essentially establish a surcharge, a 2.75% surcharge that's akin to surcharges for convention centers in Boston and Springfield and Worcester. That would be for the state's component of this. So that would be an additional 2.75% on whatever is levied. I felt really strongly about not sort of dipping into that local option for what the town gets. I believe in Truro it's at 4%, but you're able to go up to 6%. That's something, that basically is the biggest chunk of local aid that we're probably going to be able to deliver for quite some time. And I felt really strongly about not wanting to chip away at that. So this would be an additional piece. The component I've really focused on is, all right, where is this? If you're able to get this additional revenue, where do these resources go? Because you have 50 municipalities with a $4 billion problem. You've got 6 municipalities in Martha's Vineyard as well. And so how do you basically pool these resources? How do you leverage these additional resources? And how do you pair that with existing state programs for the Clean Water Trust Fund and the State Revolving Loan Fund that you have? So I've proposed creating a Cape Cod Water Protection Trust. This is where those resources, so yes, from the additional surcharge on room occupancy, but potentially federal monies that come down the pike, and a whole host of things potentially would go into, and then we'd figure out, would go into that common pot. It would be managed and tied to the existing programs within the Treasury. So we're not creating a new bureaucracy. We're not creating a new entity within regional government in any way. And that this is something that would complement the existing state programs that we have for this, but would really give communities, a leg up. I think for Truro, I think at some point we probably will need to be having a conversation about wastewater when it comes to Shore Road. And so, these are resources that would could be put to that. I think for a town like Truro, which doesn't have, as significant as a need as most any other community, I really want to make the argument that, we are all, tied in here together. I was thinking about my experience growing up here, and especially once you're, in 6th, 7th, 8th grade, but even before that, so much of our economic activity actually happens in a town in Orleans, and in Eastham and Orleans. If Orleans is not able to address its wastewater problems and build the wastewater capacity they need in their downtown, they're able to capitalize on really promising development that they may be able to have there, that really is going to impact the ability for folks who live far out on Land's End to make it. And so really, we're really in all this all together. In designing the trust, we're trying to make it so that over the course of the fund that towns can make sure they get in get back what they get in. But I think it's something that we're really, if we're able to do this, I think it'll be a really tremendous boost to moving Cape Cod towards meeting an environmental obligation that we've had with degradation, but also from a housing and a housing affordability perspective. This would really enable the development that we need in our existing downtowns that's consistent with our built environment, where you can have not just affordable, capital A affordable housing units, but housing units that really are going to meet our need, through that need. So that's a big piece that's coming up. Again, not the, for Truro and Aquinnah and Shillmark, these are towns that have less of these challenges. But I think if, just like the Up Island towns in Martha's Vineyard here on the Outer Cape, if we don't have a vibrant Lower Cape, that's a real challenge for what our communities are going to be. So we've been spending a lot of time on that. And then, want to definitely highlight was the success that all of you were able to make happen in securing property from the state to build affordable housing. This is actually the first. So the Baker administration announced this 3 years ago as a big project to identify state land and give it to local uses that was going unused. and that is we are the first municipality to benefit from it in the Commonwealth. As you know, because the Lieutenant Governor was here, I heard I had a surrogate who did a pretty decent job. But really glad to have made that happen. I'm really interested in working with all of you in, how do we maximize not only this piece of property, but really looking at redevelopment in North Truro. I'd really encourage the town. My understanding is that the assessment of what it would take to connect municipal water from that runs into Provincetown is about $85,000. I'd really encourage the town to apply for a MassWorks grant for that, paired with sidewalk upgrades. My office and I would be delighted to help you on that. We've seen a lot of success in this program elsewhere, and there's a real hunger in the administration for more Cape communities to tap into this because they haven't been tapping into this. So this could be something that could really not only be expand the number of units that's available at this site, but also potentially provide more attractive options in our existing downtowns. So very much looking forward to that. And then there's a whole host of other efforts we've been working on. The Senate took up comprehensive criminal justice reform this fall. The House followed suit. We have a conference committee that's moving forward on this. A lot of this has been in response to the opioid epidemic that has been really disproportionately impacting our communities here on Cape Cod, here on the islands. If you look at data related to the opioid epidemic, while broadly across the state we're seeing a decrease in deaths caused by opiate overdose, we're not seeing that here on Cape Cod. We're also seeing actually recent public health data is showing that we're actually seeing an uptick in HIV infections related to IV drug use in the opioid epidemic. So we've got a lot more work to do here. One piece of information, and I guess I'll share this because this is sort of related to the education topic. The county did a really fascinating look back at, so who are the people who are dying of opiate overdose from 2004 to 2014? And that basically shows that the hundreds of people on Cape Cod who've died of opiate overdose in that period, 69% of them are straight to work, so they have a high school diploma or less, meaning they haven't gone on to higher education. They probably haven't, if they grew up here, they haven't left the Cape. And 1 in 4 are involved in construction and trades. And so I think we're actually going to be planning to go to all of our school committees, especially in the middle and high school level, to talk about this with the county. But I think we have a lot of work to do here on this. And in the legislature, we'll be taking that up. And then on the issues of housing production and zoning reform, this has really been something, the Senate actually has led on this. My predecessor was able to get a bill passed in the Senate on zoning reform, but we couldn't get something done in the House last year. We're back at it again. The governor put a proposal out there, which I think is a good indication, kind of as provides, I think, some cover. It's an opening bid to what this could be. I do worry a little bit that we're increasingly getting really focused on housing production in sort of outlying areas around Boston, and that really, I really worry that these policies are just not going to be a fit for our needs. Mr. Coburn mentioned, 40B and other laws that are on the books. For our communities, I do represent communities that actually are at the 10%, and it doesn't make a difference. It doesn't make much of a difference. I think that. So what I'm going to be really working hard on doing, we're taking up a housing bond bill in January, and then we're going to have this zoning reform housing production effort, and really looking at for the needs of smaller communities. How do you just expand the tools that we can give our smaller communities where, just how these larger developments or larger incentives are designed for are just not a fit for our needs. That's just not how our communities are built. So your feedback on that would be really appreciated. And then before you know it, we're going to be in budget season, which is sort of the biggest thing that we do. So those are just sort of a few of the highlights. I'm sure I could keep talking, but what I'd really like is to get questions and comments from you folks. If there's any sort of specific things that the town has inquired that we can do for you. My district director, Leslie Sandberg, is here. She's a familiar face. So if you can't get me, you can always get Leslie. So glad to look at any sort of specific proposals from the town, and then a broader conversation about how both myself and Representative Peak can further assist the town in its goals.
Thank you very much for that, for the update. And I also just want to thank you for all the work that you've done on behalf of Truro since taking office, and particularly around getting the Cloverleaf property. And you just have been so accessible to us, and not only have you been accessible, but also your staff, which are fabulous. So I want to thank them as well.
Thank you.
For all of their efforts and on our behalf.
In this business, you're only as good as your staff, really. And I'm really fortunate. All of my staff are Cape Codders. They either live here or grew up here, and that's really important to me. And so I'm glad glad they're getting back to you.
Thank you. So I'd like to open it up for questions from my colleagues. Ms. Burgess.
Julian, you just made a nice segue regarding your staff. Your staff member, Pat Johnson, did a great job at the recent councilors and selectmen's meeting regarding your work on the healthcare bill. And we're going into budget season, and rising healthcare costs affect every type of government, whether it's municipal, state, or federal. And I was interested to learn that something like, is it 50% of the state budget is for health care, and 43% is spent on mass health,
That's
which
correct.
is Medicare. And I know that the governor did come out with a plan that the Senate was not happy with. And I wonder if you could just address a little bit the proposal and speaking about opioid addiction and need for services, how his plan with this Commonwealth Connector plan might have some negative impact on services for that area as well as others.
Glad to. So you're correct. 43% of our budget is mass health. If you add in other auxiliary health expenditures, it's over 50% of a $40 billion budget. I think Massachusetts has seen a lot of success in our bipartisan commitment around access to health care insurance. What happened when the Affordable Care Act was implemented here is we had to change how how certain structures went into existence, how certain pieces were structured. And so individuals moved from connector care onto the mass health program. There was about a 15% movement of that. Many of them actually have really benefited from being on mass health. So for instance, I've spent a lot of time talking with Heidi Nelson, who's the executive director of the Duffy Center, who handles a lot of folks who are homeless in Hyannis, and they've really had a benefit in having these folks who really kind of qualify for a broader set of care. But really looking at the budget, there's been a whole host of proposals put out there. The governor did put out a proposal. He did it quite late in the budget process, and so what the Senate and the House did is they took certain components of it. But in the Senate, we've participated in a year-long study looking at, all right, what else can we do around healthcare cost containment? What are best practices that are other states doing that we're not doing? Taking a look at things like telemedicine, expanding the scope of EMTs, so allowing an EMT to say, instead of just saying, all right, if the EMTs show up, we got to bring you to the hospital, which in our neck of the woods is a pretty big deal. Expanding that scope, looking at other scope for providers, a whole host of policies and proposals that the Senate put into a bill that we debated and we passed in November, just before the recess. This bill, I think, is most significant for us out here because of the pieces around telemedicine, around expanding access for EMTs. It's really going to help those of us who live in more far-flung places get access to care. There are kind of comparable cost savings in the Senate proposal. The House is now going to take this up. They're going to have a strategy that's different from the governor, different from the Senate, and we're going to reconcile that. And I expect that's going to happen. That'll happen probably in concert with the budget process that starts and ends sort of in the spring through the early summer. One thing I was really proud about in this, so I filed a bill that essentially has the Commonwealth look at what would be the benefits and the downsides of a single-payer system. And it's something that my predecessor had filed. I filed it. I filed this bill as an amendment to the health care reform bill that we put before, that we debated, and it was adopted 35-3. A bipartisan vote, 2 Republicans and all of the Democrats voting for this. And I think it's a real acknowledgement that increasingly just the way that we're going about doing this, there's got to be a better way. And we have to look at that. I don't know the numbers for Truro, but I'm guessing that cost of health care and health insurance is arguably probably after the school, probably the biggest expense that you have. And this is the case across all entities, whether you're a private employer in the public sector. I think especially for folks out here, where so many of us work in either really small businesses or own our own business, we may have to be self-insured. Anecdotally, I just know the experience in sort of watching my parents' health insurance costs sort of go from what it was in the early 90s, through today. Really there's got to be a better way, and so we're looking at that. Specific to the Outer Cape, something I've been working on in addition to the legislation is we've seen a decrease in available plans that you can get through Connector Care. So specifically, Neighborhood Health has pulled out of providing service on the Lower and Outer Cape. I think it came from a cost perspective, but that really limits the options for Truro and Outer Cape residents who are going onto the state's marketplace. And so that's something that we're really, I've sent a letter to Secretary Sutters, who's Secretary of Health and Human Services, and we're trying to make some traction on that. So I worry about that as well. It's pretty significant. But I think broadly to your question, there are sort of competing ideas and proposals around how we're going to deal with this. I think the good news is Massachusetts has we're sort of in a constant state of reforming our healthcare system. I think there's some really good things that are going to come out of this. I think there's other pieces that are much more complicated. And I think feedback from your municipality and your community around, your health insurance is through the county. I do represent communities that are considering making the switch to the GIC, and if that's something that should be considered, I have GIC health insurance. I think it's terrific. So if that's something our office can provide information on, glad to as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Mr. Weinstein.
Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to have someone with such close connections to our community being up in Boston facing all these difficult issues. Anyway, the last question's kind of a segue into mine that combines criminal justice reform and health care and the opioid problem. For the last few years, that's really gotten the attention, and I would like you and your colleagues to address the bigger issue, which is I use addiction with a capital A. Alcohol.
Yep.
Is a much bigger problem. It's much more costly from a medical perspective and from a criminal justice perspective. There have been recent articles in the Cape Cod Times, which you're probably aware of. This county has the woeful distinction of being at the top of the list in terms of the cost of abuse and the number of people that have died. It's almost double that of people who have died from the opioid misuse. Having said that, I'm interested in some kind of legislative direction that would move things away from being a punitive system. Right now, if somebody gets arrested for drunk driving, help is not readily available in terms of therapy or treatment centers. And as you go up the scale, if you're a continuing offender, you're put in jail. And the same is true if you're a drug abuser. And I don't see any connection between jailing an individual that has a physiological problem, which it seems the medical community has acknowledged. That's what the issue is with people who have addictions. And maybe that term has to be relooked at. But I would like the legislature now, because they are going through this motion of reform from my limited understanding that has to do with sentencing, et cetera, and what's encompassed in that part of criminal justice. And I would like a redirection with this part of something that's not only a Barnstable County issue, but a state issue, that it's much less expensive to provide someone with a therapy or medical treatment than putting them in the Barnstable County House of Correction. So that's one thing. And the other thing I would like to light a fire under, I've already spoken with your colleague Sarah Peak, who's been very receptive to this, and this is the state legislature exerting some effort with your federal colleagues on securing the North Truro Air Force Base, taking it away from the mishandling by the Department of Interior, which I will tip my hand since I seem to do that a lot, under the misdirection of our current federal administration. And I would hope that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts could exert some pressure that would get to the Department of Interior to take over. It was done with the Weymouth Naval Air Station, so this is not reinventing the wheel. And to address something that my colleagues have mentioned over and over again, it would be a perfect site for housing. There are many, many acres there, and right now it is fallow, and before Zinke and his friends get their hands on it to build a golf course or something, I would like you and your colleagues to, and I want to commend you and defend you. You were attacked in the Cape Cod Times again today for the issue around safe communities, and I want to laud what you're doing, and I for one, think you should get a big pat on the back for being a voice in that direction. So thank you very much for your thoughtfulness and your courage as a junior member of your distinct body in the state. Thank you.
Thank you. I think on the addiction point, you're absolutely right. I think we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. We're having, with the opiate epidemic, this is an acute epidemic, right? We're losing lives, and we're losing lives acutely, right? We're having people who die in the streets, but we also have the impacts of alcoholism, and the alcohol epidemic, over the course of a lifespan are very significant. This is a really big challenge across all the communities that I represent. I think part of it is just part of our geography, what our business is out here, right? We're a destination that people come to escape. Those of us who live here year round we can escape all year. But really, there's a cultural piece to this. And, some of the things I'd be interested in, I also know that there is a pretty vibrant recovery community that we have, especially here on the Outer Cape. And as we're taking up, we're going to be taking up a sort of an opioid bill 2.0. I'd be really interested to see and to figure out, all right, like what else can we do to meaningfully also address alcoholism? On the criminal justice side of things, this reform package really does move us away from a punitive system and a whole host of measures, whether it be bail, giving judges more latitude around getting people into treatment, moving away from mandatory minimums. So I think the details are being hashed out there, but I think you're going to like the direction we're going in with that. I think in part that's in response to how opioids have been impacting our community. But I think we'll get an update to you folks once that bill comes out. I think you'll like the direction we're going. I think we need to make sure that we're doing something on alcoholism, and I just don't know what that is, and I think I'm going to talk to some folks and ask them. On North Truro Air Force Base, I actually, the first place I interned in summer 2005 was with the Highland Center nonprofit group way back when, so I know the site well. A little history, I think, is when the Air Force Base was originally decommissioned, I believe it was offered to the towns of Wellfleet and Truro. And so I think that I actually have met with the Department of Interior. I traveled as part of a delegation to D.C. This past spring, met with, I forget the gentleman's title, basically chief political hack. For our communities, whereas I think in the West, this sort of perspective and policy may be very devastating. I think for us, where there's an interest in, I look to the Monomoy dispute that they have right now. This sort of this re-emphasis on local control in the current administration could be used to our benefit. I would really think, though, that would need to come from the town. So I think if the town wanted, if either the board or the town or some way to be on record and saying, hey, we want to explore whether or not we can have this come back. I think from the Seashore's perspective, the Seashore, in my understanding, has realized that this is a really significant undertaking for them. I think that if there were a $30 to $40 million appropriation that kind of came from the skies or came from the federal government, I think there would be interest in the National Park Service in sort of building some sort of interdisciplinary space. I don't know if that's the environment that we've got, right? And if you talk to the Seashore, they've got to prioritize replacing the Herring Cove parking lot or the Nauset Beach, bathhouses. So I think I would really encourage the town and to you folks to have a conversation about this. And even if it's an exploratory letter that we could then take, I would be delighted to bring this to Congressman Keating and to work with Senators Warren and Markey. There's a lot of interest in this site. The Lieutenant Governor, when she visited the site, and Secretary Jay Ash have talked to me about this site when they came here and visited. So I think there's a lot of interest, but I think that it would be putting the cart before the horse a little bit if I or Sarah Peak sort of said, hey, we want to take this from the Seashore and give it back to the town. From a development perspective, I think that to do what some folks envision there, I think there may needs to be sort of another entity for that. But I think that needs to come from you folks. And thank you for your comments on safe communities. For those of you who don't know, actually, Truro is one of the few towns that was left out. You did not get a rather sort of hateful and xenophobic mailer. Most other towns in my district did, distorting and sort of turning folks up on a bill that's really meant to give local police sort of local authority on what they're doing. So thank you for those comments.
Thank you.
Mr. Coburn.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, thank you. And I won't call you Senator anymore, Julian.
Please don't.
But
It's really weird.
I really appreciate your being here tonight, and but also just from day one, the accessibility that not only as a select board member, but also as a executive director of a nonprofit, of the great work that you've done on a whole host of issues in housing and securing funds for small business development, of helping us secure the resources we need to do the work that we do in our community. There are kind of three quick things that I want to just raise with you. One is to congratulate you on the study on the single-payer health care, something that I had the privilege of when I worked for your predecessor, Senator Wolf, of working with him. I think it is important, though, to point out that for over a decade it has been the platform of the Massachusetts State Democratic Party to have a single-payer system. And I'm glad that after a decade, the state Senate has caught up with the grassroots activists throughout the state of that we really do need to see a single-payer system to get a handle on our health care costs. The second thing that I want to just talk briefly about is the closing the loophole on the room occupancy tax to apply that to short-term property rentals. As you know, we've in Truro now voted twice for a home rule petition to do that. There are over 800 homes in our community that are up on websites that offer booking. It is potentially a significant source of revenue. But I think I've had an opportunity to look at some of the legislation that's been introduced on Beacon Hill, and I think there are four really important principles for not only Truro but other rural communities that have this dynamic of a large second home population where those properties are also then being rented seasonally. And the first is the term of the rental, and that we really need any rental that's happening for a period of 30 days or less, and even if it's only happening in the property once in the course of a year, needs to apply to this, because it's really important to point out we are not taxing the owners of the properties. We are asking their renters, who are going to pay that tax if they stay in a guest house or in a motel or a hotel in Truro, we're asking them to pay the same tax here. In fact, we even have properties in Truro that were formerly motels that have been converted to condominium motels, and absolutely no change of use whatsoever, but the change of ownership has exempted them from paying the tax, and that's nuts. We got to update the tax code so that it applies. The second is that there should be no difference in the rate of taxation based on ownership of the unit. One of the bills that's in the House has, if you're just an individual, it's one rate. Again, we're not taxing the owners of the properties. We're taxing the guests. And, leave it to Massachusetts to make something really simple, overly complicated. But in our neighboring states, it doesn't matter who owns the unit. If it's being rented on a short-term basis, it gets, the rooms tax applies. The third issue is that how important it is to preserve the local option of 2%, 4%, or 6%, because that is really an important source of revenue for us to pay for the infrastructure that it takes to accommodate a large number of visitors in our community. It's also a source of revenue for us to deal with our housing situation, because let's face it, our property owners can make a lot more money renting their properties on a weekly basis, even their little cottages or condos on a weekly basis for 10 weeks than they can renting that out year-round. And so we need basically this is a source of mitigation for that seasonal dynamic. And then finally, I think the fourth issue that's really important is that there's been a lot of discussion about a regulatory structure or oversight structure at the municipal level of inspections and health codes and rental registration. And I think it's really important for the state to really defer to the local communities to determine what level of regulation and oversight of those rental units is appropriate. Because let's be real, we have such a volume, we might be able to have enough revenue coming in and have an inspection regimen of some sort. But there are communities in the Commonwealth that basically have a population of 800 folks and don't even have full-time staff beyond a DPW director and a town clerk. And I think it really is really important that towns can, on a town-by-town basis, figure out what level of regulation makes sense. And then finally, I am interested in hearing more and working more with you on the Water Protection Trust. I do think that there's perhaps a perception here in Truro that, the sewer is the Mid-Cape's problem, not ours. And Provincetown already addressed their situation. And I think it's really important to challenge that perception, and that we really could use some resources to deal with our wastewater. Because let's face it, the choice that we really have in town to deal with some growth and continued and to address our affordability of our housing is really tied to infrastructure. If we don't have resources to deal with wastewater, we're going to end up solving this problem on an acre-by-acre basis, which is the most expensive way to build housing. And quite frankly, when it comes to affordable housing, is completely unsustainable. Whereas if we have resources to do some sewering, if we could tie North Truro and Shore Road into Provincetown sewer system and have the resources to do that, that opens up a whole bunch of possibilities for us to target in some specific areas density, to be able to offer a variety of housing styles so that our seniors no longer have to leave town when they downsize, that there'd be nice little apartments in North Truro or in other targeted areas of town. And it allows us to preserve the open space and not develop every developable acre lot that we have in town. So I really look forward to continuing to work with you on that project and make sure that we can have the resources to make the infrastructure investments that we need to accommodate growth in Truro, but also preserve our rural character.
Thank you. On room occupancy, those four principles if you haven't seen what the Senate has done, I think you would really like what the Senate has done. This is essentially for a clean extension. If you are renting a room for one night, 2 nights, every night of the year, you are subject to this. You know, I think that on the regulatory structure piece, and this is something I know pretty well because I spent 6 years at the Department of Public Health, our local boards of health are tasked with having to do so much. If we tasking them with having to do anything more onerous as it relates to a mandated level of inspection or reporting, it's just not going to get done. It's not going to happen. And so, you know, I very much support and defer to the local communities. The more complicated proposals have come out, I think, in response to that we've been dealing with this problem for a long time. Communities like the North End in Boston have been dealing with this problem now. It's sort of emerged 4, 5, 6 years of folks coming in, buying up, you know, maybe a 4-story tenement brownstone building that were apartments, turning it into rental. You know, so this is where some of those proposals have come in. I'm hopeful that a cleaner, the cleaner policy will prevail. I think it's just more simple. And even from a revenue collection perspective, the more we make this a headache, I just think it's just not an efficient way to do this. You know, I think that I'm glad to hear that I think the town may think to benefit from a housing production trust. One thing I didn't mention earlier, so this Cape Cod Commission came up with this fantastic report looking at, all right, how much housing do we actually need to create this to be a sustainable communities? And most of the communities I represent, these are hefty numbers, right? It's hundreds of units, in some cases thousands of units. In Truro, it's 64. There has to be a way that we can figure out how to build 64 units in this town. I mean, that is so doable for us. I think we've got to we got to make sure, you know, you look at a place like North Truro, if we're able to connect in water, that's a place that can be done. If we look at other places, 64 units really is achievable. And so if there's anything that I can do, whether it be from a policy perspective at the state, if it's a more political perspective, as sort of a native son who cares really strongly about this, and I think who, you know, for better or worse, I sort of embody, and my generation embodies what's going to, you know, how we go here is going to be determined. What we do in the next 5 or 6 years is going to really determine if we can stay here. But I think 64 units is so doable. We got to figure out a way to do this. I don't know if there are zoning changes that need to be made that we need to bring back to town meeting, and we need to circumvent certain sort of recalcitrant boards that just don't get it. You know, if I can say that more publicly, if I can be, however I can be helpful on this, I'm really glad to, because I think that, you know, if we've already wasted so much time on this issue, I think, but we're moving forward now, and just however I can help.
You know, I would just add, my colleagues have, and Ms. Worthington, I'm going to turn it over to you just in a second if you have questions, and Ms. Palmer. But I want to add on to something you just said, which is, you know, there's all of these things, as you know, are so interrelated, and infrastructure is huge for us out here in terms of affordable, both capital A and small A affordable housing. And as you know, we're going to bring forward a zoning, a town meeting article which will create a process for condominiums to go year round. One of the issues that's related to that is infrastructure, because if we had water and sewer, it would make that process more economical for some, because in many instances, the way it stands right now, it's not going to be economical for most condominium owners and associations to do this. And it gets back to your point, which you began with, which is we need more diversity in housing stock. So it's in addition to creating the 64, 65 units of capital A affordable housing, we need to be able to create more diversity in the housing stock. And that also relates to the Cloverleaf property because, and I know you're already working on this, is being able to free up money that will allow us to bring into that project differing affordability levels, not just at 80% AMI, but maybe even up to 150 or above. But we're going to need assistance in order to be able to do that. So I just wanted to tack on to all of that was said. Ms. Worthington.
Well, I would just like to second that, because I'm really interested in the diversity of housing. And if, and if the water issue is what we need to do, then I think we need to start talking about that. Because, I'd like to be able to say that somebody who has a store could have an apartment above it, and that, there are people that work for them or whoever else could live there. I mean, I think that's really important. And the other thing, when you were talking about the EMTs, because, I did that for so long, I was wondering if there's an elder population component to that, because it really would make sense, I think, if EMTs or paramedics joining somehow, and this you'd have to figure out because I don't know how you'd do it, but with the fire departments, because there's so many instances with elderly people especially who need just wellness checks or, blood pressure checks. And the way it is now, they'll often go to the fire department and the fire department is on a call, or, they can't give them the attention. But there may be a way, to somehow integrate paramedics and EMTs into the fire department, into the community, to reach out more and go to homes and do wellness checks, for instance. But I know it's a bigger issue in terms of how the health care would come into that. But I hope somebody's got that on their mind, the component of homebound elderly people. And
That's a huge challenge that we have in our communities. I mean, and I just was reminded of this again I think 2 weeks ago, joined the Meals on Wheels program that we have here on the Outer Cape, and bringing meals to, folks who are primarily homebound in Wellfleet and Truro. And it's a real reminder of something that you really know, and how isolated that people are in our community, especially older people. From the bill perspective, it starts with allowing municipalities and the EMTs to reimburse, right, to get a higher rate of reimbursement. But there's actually some other proposals. My colleague Adam Hines, who represents the Berkshires, so we're quite close because we sort of represent opposite ends of the state. He was able to get an amendment adopted that gets to some of these pieces that you're looking at. So I need to do some homework and look at what the amendment is. But it was something that I worked to support him on, because I think it was something that we thought could help, at least in expanding the authority and the ability, and also from a reimbursement perspective, especially in a community like we have here, where you have volunteer fire departments and EMTs. So I'll follow up on that.
Okay. And it's great to see you here.
Ms. Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for saving the best for last, Senator. I just wanted to touch on some things we're doing that, much of which you mentioned. Both Truro and Provincetown joined together to hire an insurance firm, firm that provides insurance consulting, to evaluate our healthcare plans and to look at whether that's the best thing for us. So as you were talking, I realized that it would probably be useful if Leslie and I met and I got you up to date, because it's interesting also, one of the things that slowed the Cloverleaf down was the DOT's perspective on transit-oriented housing that they're working on in the Boston area, so that they kept trying to make that model fit here on the Outer Cape, which obviously isn't going to work. So I think it's very astute of you that you kind of talked about some of what you're working on wouldn't work here, but it works better in Boston. And I think that what that year and a half or 2 years it took is a testament to that. We're also talking, Provincetown and I, about the whole water sewer issue, because we might not have the issues, but not just water would help with like the Cloverleaf, but so would sewer or some kind of sewage treatment plant. We'd be able to get more units. So those conversations are ongoing. We've actually talked about the trust and whether some of that money could be used for an expansion of that system. So I think, again, we need to just hook up a little bit more and talk about it.
Rand, if I could just jump in an important point about that. I think there's some mumbling in Provincetown that Truro needs to be building more affordable housing. And both of our affordable housing units, sites, are smaller than they could be because they're within the zone of protection, wellhead protection districts for Provincetown's water,
Right.
largely Provincetown's water system, and therefore we have reduced nitrogen loading capability because of where those properties are located.
Right.
So if we had sewer, it would be a different ballgame.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that's, not just on Beach Point, but could we somehow get it down Route 6, which would be a better corridor for us. So, those are big dreams, but if you don't think about it, it's never going to happen. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on was with the change in administration at the seashore, there's a much more open door. And we have had some conversations about the Air Force Base, nothing solid, but also I have talked to Secretary Ash's office about it. So I think that your conversation here, and I really appreciate it, it was really informative, really makes me realize that we need to be in touch more about what's going on and kind of on a day-to-day operational. So I'll resolve to do that.
Thank you. And even if there's, on the Air Force Base piece, even if there's a letter from this board or someone just saying, hey, there's an interest in this, we want, Senator Cyr, we want you to take a look at how, we navigate this or something like that. I think that that would help give us at least the to know that the town is sort of behind us looking at it.
Okay.
And I think really want to commend you and your counterpart town managers as well. I think there's been a lot of collaboration across, certainly with Provincetown, I think Wellfleet, other communities as well. That really makes a difference. So many of the issues that we're facing are across the region. I kind of like to say that if you were going to take a look at this peninsula of about like 220,000 people, that swells much bigger in the summer, no one in their right mind would say, all right, we're going to divvy this up into 15 distinct municipalities. One's going to be 2,000, and one's going to be up to like 34,000. Right? That's the world that we're in, right? That we've inherited. And it certainly makes our communities really special. It also makes doing the work of municipal governance really hard and challenging and sticky. And so that collaboration is really appreciated. And if there's anything that we can ever do to assist in that, I know that some communities have actually started on the housing front, that Nantucket and Provincetown have started kind of chatting with each other because they're sort of very similar in a lot of ways. I don't know if there would be interest. I look at a community like West Tisbury or Chilmark on Martha's Vineyard, who actually face so many of the same issues that we have here in Truro. If our office can ever facilitate any of that, I think there's a lot of really good work going around the region, but sometimes it's happening in silos. And so the more that we can do to share that, I think just moves us forward, gets us a better product, and I think also helps shift the burden and the load of that work.
Yeah, thank you. And the last thing is I have to commend your staff. They have been so helpful. So thank you.
Well, I'm sure we have many more things we could talk about tonight. But I want to thank you very much for taking the time to be with us tonight and for your leadership and being such a great state senator for us and representing not just the needs of Truro, but the unique needs of the Cape and Islands, which, sometimes get lost in people love the Cape, but then they forget about us when it comes to what we really need. Yeah. So I greatly appreciate your leadership on that. So thank you.
Thank you for your service, because I think that, you get a lot of attention, you get a lot of credit when you get to be, the state senator. And I think that especially serving on the Board of Selectmen, there's a whole host of tough decisions that you have to make, and then you're going to make them, and you're going to get yelled at the dump the next day.
That's why I don't go to the dump.
And most of you now rely on not going to spouses and friends to go to the dump for you. But, I think that is, now more than ever, we need folks who are committed to, serving in our local governments. And I just think, really, really thank you for your service.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you also for helping us identify future leaders in our community, too. So we will continue to do that together.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you.